Fences to keep refugees out, armed border hunters, and a new law to imprison all asylum seekers. The Hungarian government's management of the refugee crisis is being criticized. But is the European Union doing enough to help overwhelmed member states? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Dareen Abughaida. A new law has been signed in Hungary to allow the detention of all asylum seekers, including 14-year-old children and above. So new fences along the border with Serbia are also planned. That's to try and prevent a new wave of refugees. Amnesty International says the new measures are a violation of international law. Jonah Hull reports from a camp near Hungary's border with Romania.
Hungary's treatment of refugees and asylum seekers has reached a new low. This is one of 3 asylum detention centres, mostly young men but some families as well, locked up for months in conditions the European Court of Human Rights this week judged illegal.
It is a place where asylum seekers are being locked up just for being asylum seekers. People get very little information about their cases. There is a lack of proper translators in these facilities. There's a lack of contact with the outside world. I mean, people are being stripped off of their mobile phones, for instance, so they can't keep in contact with, family and loved ones.
They're being kept essentially like prisoners.
They are kept like prisoners. I would say that prisoners are kept in better ways often, because at least they have access to, visitors and that kind of stuff, which these guys don't.
We weren't allowed in, filming instead from the street outside the Békéscsaba facility, where many of the 102 people detained had ended a brief hunger strike a day earlier. We spoke instead to NGO workers with knowledge of the conditions inside. Maria Barna is a clinical psychologist. She visits Békéscsaba every week and says up to 3/4 of those housed there suffer some form of mental distress.
I would say that there's the triad that we most often come across is that of post-traumatic symptoms, depression and anxiety symptoms. By the time they arrive to Hungary, they have been through months and months of pretty torturous journeys, being detained, being abused by smugglers, crossing, seas and whatnot. So they're extremely vulnerable, and detention, really what we see is that it harms even those who prior to that didn't have any, issues.
This is a drawing by one of Maria's worst affected patients, a 22-year-old Afghan man.
Tell me, where is the human rights? All Europeans are saying that it's a human right. It's not a human right. They are destroying our future. Why?
In recent days, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán gave his answer.
Our laws are obligatory for everyone, thus also for those migrants who want to cross the borders of Hungary illegally. That is the reality, which cannot be concealed behind charming human rights nonsense.
This government does not value human rights highly.
Another reason that these people are so agitated is that they know this country is perhaps days away from finalising a new law that will see asylum seekers and refugees put into 2 so-called transit camps, from which the only way out is backwards, across the border and out the way they came. In other words, they know that everything they have been through up to this point may soon have been in vain.
The police stopped us asking any questions outside the Békéscsaba detention facility.
But I just want to ask this man where he comes from.
We didn't really need to know how these people feel, locked up inside Europe, hopeless and bitterly disillusioned. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Southern Hungary.
Well, we asked a Hungarian government spokesman about a new volunteer force known as Border Hunters. It supports police units on Hungary's southern border. Here's what he said.
It is impossible in Hungary for any kind of paramilitary group to carry weapons and patrol the border without being noticed. We keep 6,000 to 8,000 troops at the border, including Frontex people, including troops from Central Europe. Can you possibly imagine that it would be possible for any kind of paramilitary organization to rule the border area. No, it's simply a lie. We see people who are trying to defend their own property in certain villages and locations around the border side. Shouldn't mix it up with any kind of paramilitary organization.
And the government spokesman has also been replying to accusations that Hungarian forces are assaulting refugees.
It would be impossible to do anything like that, beat people up, treat them inhumanely in the focus of international attention, and again, troops and personnel underground. We provide everything that is required by international law, and we are here to ensure that Europe is being protected against illegal migration, illegal migrants.
Well, many of the refugees are fleeing from war-torn countries like Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan. And here's where they are heading for in Europe this year. The International Organization for Migration says more than 20,000 refugees have traveled so far, the vast majority by sea. 525 migrants have died or are missing in the Mediterranean Sea. Italy is the most popular destination for refugees from Western African countries. Nearly 16,000 have arrived. And Greece is another country of first arrivals for migrants, mostly from the Middle East and South Asia. Now, Hungary and Bulgaria have accepted around 400. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Geneva is Vincent Cochetel. He's the director of the UNHCR Europe Bureau. From Brussels is Elizabeth Collett. She's the director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe. Joining us via Skype from Berlin is Raphael Bossong. He's a research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Welcome, all of you, to Inside Story. Vincent, so this new law that we're talking about, effectively allowing all asylum seekers, including children older than 14, to be detained in border container camps. Some people, in fact, calling them shipment containers. Now, we know that the UNHCR is saying it's very concerned about this law, but what will the actual impact be on the refugees and migrants who are now trying to come to Hungary?
Well, it's gonna hurt people. I mean, this is totally unnecessary for the vast majority of the people. The mandatory detention of asylum seekers is contrary to Hungary's obligation under international and European law. And I'm glad that your journalist referred to asylum seekers, because the official toxic narrative of the authorities about the illegal migrants coming to Hungary, when you're looking at the facts, you had 1,133 asylum seekers this year in Hungary. So not a crisis, something very manageable, and they come mainly from 3 countries, Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. And these are people that have already suffered quite a lot in their home country, on the way to Hungary, and we find that measure deplorable.
Elizabeth, the Hungarian government spokesman, we were playing some sound a short while ago, saying that Europeans understand that protecting the border must be a priority, and this is in fact an obligation under the Schengen Treaty. So they seem to say that they want to use what they're describing as discipline, law and order in this case. Is this the right approach?
Well, of course, protecting external borders is a priority for the European Union, but within the framework of existing EU law. And existing EU laws are very clear about the fact that if someone is making a claim for asylum, they should then be treated fairly and properly under the EU asylum legal frameworks. And that does limit the ability of governments to detain. I think what is concerning particularly about this law is that there are lots of infringements of EU law that take place on a daily basis in terms of micro infractions. But this is the Hungarian government saying we're going to pass a law. We know what the EU framework is, but we're going to pass a law that seems to be directly contravening that. And I think that's something that's really a direct challenge to the European institutions and other member states, to say that we are no longer complying with the asylum acquis.
We'll talk about other European states in a moment, but Raphael, the Prime Minister of Hungary himself, appears to be justifying these measures that are being taken against the refugees. And what he said is that immigration is the Trojan horse of terrorism. What's your point of view? Will these new measures protect Hungarians, as is the claim of the government, or is it simply going to endanger the lives of those people who are leaving war-torn countries and taking the risk trying to cross to Europe?
No, I'm joining in the general criticism that we've heard. I mean, it's really not a fair characterization to say that the indiscriminate detention of all migrants and all asylum seekers coming to Hungary could be passed as a kind of reasonable counterterrorism measures. It's generally illegal to do that on an indiscriminate basis. And secondly, this detention by itself, even if one would assume there is an interest in fighting terrorism, doesn't help much. What you would need is, of course, a much better networking of information to check people's backgrounds, and that's something also the European countries are working on, but that's not necessarily or directly connected to detention in these kind of makeshift camps. So there is some concern about some possible use of migration flows for terrorist purposes, but it's a much more targeted manner.
But when you say there is some concern for terrorist purposes, how do you justify that?
So, for example, in the hotspots that have been set up already some time ago in Greece and Italy, and they're controversial too, so I'm not saying this is the reason why they exist, but in those hotspots where migrants are registered, Frontex and Europol are supporting, they say, the national authorities to check backgrounds of people who are registered and then hopefully finding people who might pose a threat. So but this is a second line check in specific formats, and that's mainly happening after registration, and there is no reason in that logic to detain people for a prolonged period of time for that sort of specific counterterrorism reason. And by no means is anybody suggesting that the vast majority of thousands of people are blanket terrorist suspects. That's not the case.
Elizabeth, this issue of automatic detention for asylum seekers, it was a measure that was suspended back in 2013, from what we understand, after pressure from human rights groups, and now it is being reintroduced. Why now?
I think this is all part and parcel of a broader political debate that's going on within the European Union at the moment, and has been sparked by the increased flows we've seen over the last couple of years. What we heard Hungary saying towards the end of last year was, we'd like to see a different form of solidarity emerge within the European Union. We will manage our borders, but we're not really interested in hosting refugees or asylum seekers. That's not going to be our job. We will leave that to other countries. For other European countries, the idea that you have a Schengen area of free mobility goes hand in hand with those obligations to adjudicate asylum claims and host refugees. So this falls into a broader category of statements that have been made by the Hungarian government, including the referendum on relocation last year, which is really Hungary challenging the idea that the European Union as a whole and every single member state has an obligation towards refugees. And that also goes hand in hand with many of the sort of very xenophobic statements about refugees becoming a sort of harbours of terrorists and not being welcome in Hungary. For me, this is part of that broader political debate and that broader challenge.
We'll come back to that point in a moment, but Vincent, let me just get your take on this this issue of border hunters. You heard the response by the government spokesman a short while ago. What we understand is that these, as they're being called, border hunters, will be armed with pistols, batons, pepper spray and handcuffs, and effectively given the mission of beating refugees, some people say, back from the country's borders. What's your take on that?
We have already received testimonies that it is happening at the Hungarian border with Serbia. This is unfortunately not just happening at that border, it happens at many other European borders these days. This requires action by the authorities, supervision, action by the authorities. It is possible for Hungary to protect its border, protect its citizens, but also protect people in need of international protection. The two are not incompatible.
Elizabeth, on the issue of the European Union, there's been sharp criticism of Hungary by other European countries. But does that just mask the issue that, in fact, there is no standardized policy for the EU as a whole when it comes to the refugee and migrant and asylum seekers issue? So Hungary might just be bearing the brunt of criticism.
So I think Hungary is not alone in the fact that standards are being applied haphazardly across the European Union. We've seen the challenges that have been experienced in Greece and Italy and other countries. We've also seen the fact that over the last 2 years, it's clear that not every country has the same idea about how to manage asylum flows. And we've also seen a breakdown of trust between countries, which has been critical. And that breakdown of mutual trust, which is the bedrock of cooperation within the European Union, has led a number of countries to take what I would term a beggar thy neighbour approach to management. We've seen a number of countries within the Schengen zone reintroduce temporary internal border controls in Austria, Denmark, Sweden and elsewhere because they have lost faith that other countries will manage the flows effectively. Hungary's response to that is, well, we are being responsible, we are managing our flows, we are being a good member state in that respect. However, they are only really interested in the border management part of it and not the protection part of it, which is where other countries have a deep problem. So certainly I think this manifests in different ways in different countries, but in terms of Hungary's very open decision to do automatic detention and to create these transit camps has gone, I think, a step further than most other countries.
So, Raphael, does this just show how divided then European countries are on the matter?
We haven't really seen a breakthrough since the confrontation in 2015. And may I just add to the previous question? I mean, yes, Hungary is not alone, but don't forget that the kind of breach of the border, let's say, if we put it that way, between Hungary and Germany, sort of the opening, the Merkel moment in autumn, was exactly those two countries. And that's why also Hungary is also still in the spotlight as, you know, the kind of the avant-garde of taking the most repressive and hardline. And Orban seems to have interpreted that shift from 2015 to the policies we have now, that he was right in the sense that, you know, Merkel sort of been rolling back on various sort of more open policies and strengthening border security, and Hungary is seen itself as this kind of pace setter to a certain extent, and this could be seen in a similar light if you want to sort of have the most critical reading. So European member states are still divided, particularly on sort of solidarity and so-called burden sharing, but they are very much agreeing on strengthening external border security. That's the kind of common political discourse. The question is how to do this in a kind of acceptable manner, and beneath this kind of shared discourse on we've strengthened borders,
there seems to be that some people saying that maybe some European states, Raphael, now are sort of passing the buck onto other countries, with the Austrians recently saying that they're calling on setting up refugee centers in the Western Balkans, in Georgia and in Egypt. So is that what they're doing? Are they just trying to pass on the quote-unquote problem?
I mean, that's not a new thing at all, that the European Union has tried to kind of cooperate with third countries in its neighborhood to kind of stem the flow and cooperate. And a lot of this cooperation makes sense. But of course, how far do you go and how much is it just externalization? And the Turkey agreement, of course, being the most famous one, which is just 1 year from now.
Which we'll talk about in a second, which we'll address in just a moment. But Vincent, can I ask you this? The UNHCR has documented the impact that these increased border restrictions introduced back in 2016, in fact, on refugee and migrant movements have actually had. But isn't the real fundamental problem here that there are just no safe and legal channels, for refugees to come into Europe?
Absolutely, because the discourse that is consists into saying let's combat trafficking, I think we all agree. Let's try to reinforce the capacity of other countries outside of the European Union to offer protection to refugees. I think we all agree. But at the end of the day, the part of the discourse on opening legal channel towards Europe, I mean, has not materialized. That part of the discourse is not credible in terms of numbers. I mean, we only had 7,000 refugees resettled from Turkey to the European Union member states in 2016, so it's far below the needs. When you look at other countries, you know, on the Eastern African route going to Libya and then to Europe, I was looking at the number of Eritreans resettled to Europe over the last 3 years. It's 55 out of Ethiopia in 3 years. It's 1,200 out of Sudan in 3 years. So those alternative pathways for people to access safely to protection to Europe do not exist.
Elizabeth, Raphael was mentioning a moment ago the EU-Turkey deal. So let's look at that for a moment, because this week, in fact, marks a year, as you know, since the implementation of that deal. However, NGOs saying that people are now forced to live in degrading conditions and asylum seekers are barred from exercising their right to a fair asylum process, specifically on Greek islands, as a result of this deal. So this is really in stark contrast to the official view that was hailed by the European Union, as at the time it was being called a breakthrough.
So I think there is three ways to judge the EU-Turkey deal. The sole metric for success from the point of view of many European leaders were, will this affect flows to Greece and onwards through the European Union? And the combination of the EU-Turkey deal and the closure of borders along the Western Balkans route meant that numbers dropped precipitously. They didn't drop they haven't disappeared completely, and there are still flows going through, but it's gone from a state of intolerable dysfunction to tolerable dysfunction. So from the point of view of many heads of state, this has been a success. But as soon as you look under the bonnet of the deal and you look at the mechanics of it, what we can see is that for Greece and the situation in Greece, the situation has deteriorated considerably for those people who find themselves in that country. On the Greek islands, conditions are extremely poor. There are long waiting times to have asylum claims adjudicated. Relocation is still sluggish out of the country. So while numbers have dropped into the country, conditions have got more difficult in Greece. And it's not clear that there are really sustainable solutions to that, in a context where, and I think this is the part that concerns leaders at the moment, in a context where there's quite a lot of saber rattling going on from Turkey, threatening to end the deal, threatening to increase flows to the European Union. And there is concern that Turkey, if they terminated the deal, would create an even more precarious situation in Greece right now. And I think it's particularly difficult for the European Union, which has supplied funding to Greece to try and support asylum seekers and migrants who find themselves in that country. But so far, a lot of that hasn't yet reached that population in order to offer them adequate reception conditions.
Raphael, I see you want to weigh in on this issue of the EU-Turkey deal.
I mean, I think the question now, apart from it holding, is, how much of it is replicated in the European neighborhood. There is not going to be a one-on-one replication. But I think, now all eyes are on Libya and to a less extent on Tunisia. And so if it's going to be terminated, some countries like Hungary and Austria will say, oh, we're fine and we can just stop them, like with these kind of harsh repressive measures. But other countries, including Germany, will be very worried, not only because of the results through the Balkans, but also what it means for further cooperation with Northern Africa, because that's really where, the next wave of debate is already and will continue for months to come. So it's really a complex that hangs together and remains very sensitive. So consensus is far from being reached.
And Vincent, from a human rights perspective, from a UN perspective, what's your concern when it comes to the Turkey-EU deal? And do you agree when the NGOs say that basic human rights are lost in the process of this EU-Turkey deal, even though the numbers have dwindled?
Okay, I would dissociate the EU-Turkey statement from the discussion around Libya, because we are not comparing two similar things. In the context of Turkey, you cannot say there is no space for asylum for Syrians in Turkey. There are conditions of receptions, there is a legislative framework. The Turkish authorities and Turkish municipalities have done a lot to try to host 3 million Syrian refugees. Having said that, the legal frameworks are not perfect and do not apply to other refugees from other backgrounds. So we need still to build a functioning asylum system in Turkey. And we don't change geography, so Europe has to invest without condition in the building of the asylum system in Turkey, as well as in other countries in its neighborhood. Now, we can understand the political rationale for the EU-Turkey statement. Some of the measures have translated into better access to rights for Syrian refugees, in particular to get access to education and to a lesser extent to get access to jobs in Turkey. So there's been some positive impact of the funding of the European Union for the situation in Turkey. But the system is very fragile, and as the European Union knows it itself, it takes a lot of years to build a functioning asylum system. So any deal between European Union and its neighbour has to be based on the long-term perspective, on sustainability, on trust, and on responsibility sharing, and not just a plan of containment.
Okay, on that note, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to all of my guests, Vincent, Elizabeth, and Raphael. And thank you for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.